What if the season of loneliness and isolation you're experiencing is exactly where God wants you to be? Why does he sometimes call his chosen to walk alone even before the big breakthrough? Today, we're uncovering the hidden truth behind why God leads his people into isolation before he reveals their destiny, and how this season of silence can be the most powerful preparation of all. Stick around to discover why isolation is not the end, but the beginning of your greater purpose. When we think of God's chosen ones, we often picture lives full of blessings, success, and fulfillment. It's easy to imagine that those who are called by God are automatically granted everything they need, from wealth to fame to success. After all, doesn't God reward his faithful with ease and comfort? But the reality for many of God's chosen is far different. Often before they step into their destiny, they face a season of isolation, where they seem to be cut off from everything familiar, family, friends, and even the world they once knew. This period of solitude is not a mistake or a punishment. It is a divine strategy. Isolation is often a time where the chosen are separated from the distractions of everyday life, allowing them the space and quiet to hear God's voice more clearly. It's during this time that God shapes their character, prepares them for the mission ahead, and teaches them how to depend fully on him. The isolation can feel painful, even lonely, but it is precisely in these moments that God is doing his deepest work. Many of the Bible's greatest figures, from Moses in the desert to David in the wilderness, spent significant periods in isolation before stepping into their divine callings. We might think that isolation is a time when God has forgotten about us, or when he is punishing us for something. But in reality, it's a time of deep preparation. God uses this season to mold and refine his chosen ones, just as he did with those in the Bible who endured isolation and were later used mightily. The wilderness is not a place of abandonment. It's a place of divine preparation for something greater that lies ahead. This is why, if you're in a season of isolation, it might just be the beginning of the extraordinary calling God has on your life. To understand why God calls his chosen into seasons of isolation, it's important to first recognize the deeper purpose behind it. God doesn't isolate his people because he wants to punish them or leave them in despair. He isolates them because he wants to prepare them for something greater. The truth is, many of God's greatest servants were shaped and refined in periods of solitude, where they were forced to rely solely on God and his provision. This is the time when distractions fade, and God has the full attention of his chosen ones. It is in this solitude that he does his most intimate work, purging, teaching, and molding them into the people he has called them to be. Consider Moses, for instance. He spent 40 years in the desert, away from his people and his previous life in Egypt. He could have easily viewed this time as a period of rejection, but instead, it was a time of preparation. God used those years to refine Moses, to teach him humility, and to prepare him for the great mission ahead, leading the Israelites out of Egypt. During this time, Moses learned to fully trust God, relying on his provision and guidance rather than his own abilities. Had Moses not spent those years in isolation, he may not have been ready for the monumental task God called him to. David too experienced a similar process. Although anointed as king, David spent many years in the wilderness, running from Saul and hiding in caves. He was isolated from his family and friends, and yet, during this time, God was developing David's character, preparing him to be a king who would lead Israel with a heart for God. The wilderness wasn't a time of abandonment. It was a time of growth and transformation. David emerged from this period stronger, wiser, and more dependent on God than ever before. Even Jesus himself went through a season of isolation before beginning his public ministry. Before he performed miracles, healed the sick, and preached the good news, Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and praying. It was in the wilderness that Jesus was tempted by the devil, yet he remained steadfast in his obedience to God. This time of isolation wasn't just about physical preparation. It was about spiritual preparation. Jesus emerged from the wilderness empowered and ready for the work ahead, fully equipped to fulfill the mission he had been given. In each of these examples, we see that isolation is not an accident or a punishment. It is a divine strategy. God leads his chosen ones into isolation to purify their hearts, strengthen their faith, and teach them to rely on him completely. It is in this solitude that God prepares them for the greater destiny he has planned for them. Though isolation may feel difficult, it is the foundation upon which their calling is built. The Bible is filled with powerful examples of individuals who were called to periods of isolation before stepping into their true purpose. These moments of solitude were not times of abandonment or neglect, but seasons of deep transformation and preparation for what God had planned. Let's look at a few key biblical figures who experienced isolation and how their time away from the world was crucial to fulfilling their divine calling. One of the most notable examples is Moses. After he fled Egypt, Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, tending sheep and living a simple life far from the comforts of his royal Egyptian upbringing. This period of isolation seemed like a detour from his calling, but it was in the desert that Moses encountered God in the burning bush, where he received the command to return to Egypt and free the Israelites. During those years of isolation, Moses learned humility, patience, and reliance on God. He had to be stripped of his self-sufficiency and prepared to lead millions of people out of bondage. Without those years in isolation, Moses wouldn't have been ready for the massive task that lay ahead. David's story is another example of how God uses isolation to prepare his chosen ones. After David was anointed as the future king of Israel, he spent years hiding in caves, fleeing from King Saul's pursuit. David was separated from his family, friends, and the comfort of the palace. This time of isolation was not easy. It was a season filled with fear, hardship, and loneliness. But during this time, David's faith and reliance on God deepened. He wrote many of the Psalms during this period, pouring out his heart to God and learning to trust in God's timing. The isolation prepared David not only to be the king of Israel, but to be a king after God's own heart. Had he not spent this time in solitude, he might not have developed the strength, patience, and trust in God that would later define his reign. Jesus' time in the wilderness is perhaps the most profound example of all. Before beginning his public ministry, Jesus spent 40 days in isolation, fasting and praying in the desert. During this time, he was tempted by the devil and faced deep spiritual battles. Yet, Jesus emerged from this isolation stronger and more resolute in his mission. This period of solitude wasn't just a physical fast, it was a spiritual preparation for the ministry he was about to embark on. The isolation allowed Jesus to prepare spiritually and emotionally for the challenges he would face as he walked in his divine purpose. Just as Moses and David had to endure seasons of isolation to be ready for their destinies, Jesus too had to be prepared for the work he was called to do. These examples from Scripture show us that isolation is often a necessary step in God's plan for his chosen ones. It is during these seasons of solitude that we are refined, tested, and prepared for the purpose God has in store for us. Though isolation may seem difficult, it is in these times that God shapes us into the people he needs us to be, just as he did with Moses, David, and Jesus. The benefits of isolation in the spiritual journey are often underestimated because the word itself evokes feelings of loneliness and abandonment. However, for those who are chosen by God, isolation is not a curse. It's a blessing wrapped in discomfort. The wilderness, the desert, the quiet, lonely places where God calls His people are often the very environments where God's greatest work is done in their lives. One of the greatest benefits of isolation is the opportunity for deep reflection. In the busyness of life, it's easy to be distracted by the noise of the world, social media, the opinions of others, and the constant rush of daily responsibilities. But when God calls His chosen into a time of isolation, He often removes these distractions to allow for deep reflection. It's in these moments that individuals are able to take a step back and reflect on their lives, their purpose, and their relationship with God. This time of reflection allows for a deeper understanding of who they are in Christ, what they are being called to, and how they can align their lives more closely with God's will. Isolation also gives the chosen a chance to be refined. It's easy to carry a sense of self-reliance when life is comfortable and full of external support. But in isolation, all of that is stripped away. The comfort, the praise, the recognition. None of it exists in solitude. This is a refining process where God's chosen are forced to confront their weaknesses, fears, and imperfections. It's in isolation that we learn to rely solely on God's strength and grace. God uses this period to purify our hearts, remove distractions, and prepare us for the responsibilities ahead. Just as gold is refined in fire, so too are we refined in the furnace of isolation. In this solitude, we become more resilient, more dependent on God's provision, and more willing to obey His voice. Another benefit of isolation is the deepening of one's relationship with God. In the hustle of daily life, it's easy to take our relationship with God for granted. But when we are isolated, we are given the opportunity to seek God without distractions. It's in these quiet moments that God speaks the loudest. Like Moses on Mount Sinai, Jesus in the wilderness, and David in the caves, isolation creates an environment where we can hear God's voice more clearly. It's in the stillness that God reveals Himself in powerful ways, strengthening our faith and giving us the direction we need. During these times, God pours into us, equips us, and fills us with His presence, preparing us for the work He has called us to. Finally, isolation brings clarity of purpose. In a world filled with competing voices and constant distractions, it can be hard to discern what God truly wants for our lives. But when we are alone with Him, He begins to clarify our purpose. In the stillness, we can hear God's voice without the interference of external opinions or pressures. It's in isolation that God can reveal the next steps in His plan for our lives, aligning our hearts and minds with His will. The clarity that comes in this time of solitude equips us to step into the next season of our calling with confidence, knowing exactly what God has prepared for us. Isolation may feel like a lonely, difficult season, but in reality, it's one of the most powerful and transformative experiences God can give His chosen. It is during these times that God does some of His deepest work, shaping, refining, and equipping us for the destiny He has prepared. Without these seasons of solitude, we would not be able to carry the weight of the calling that God has for us. So, while isolation may not always be comfortable, it is undeniably beneficial, drawing us closer to God and preparing us for the greater purpose that lies ahead. While isolation can be a time of great growth, it's not without its challenges. The emotional weight of being alone, the doubts that creep in, and the fear of never stepping into the calling we feel God has for us can all be overwhelming. The natural response to isolation is often one of frustration, confusion, and even a sense of failure. It's easy to feel like God has forgotten you, or that you've been abandoned in your struggle. These feelings of loneliness can become even more intense when we see others seemingly thriving, achieving their dreams, and enjoying success. The temptation to compare ourselves to those around us can make the isolation feel even more painful. It's in these moments of struggle that we have to remind ourselves that isolation is not a sign of abandonment, but a sign of God's active work in our lives. God is not punishing us. He is preparing us. But it's hard to see that when we're deep in the loneliness, wondering if the silence means we've been forgotten. The emotional toll of isolation often leads to self-doubt, making us question our worth and purpose. We start to wonder if the dreams God placed in our hearts will ever come to pass, or if we are just stuck in a never-ending waiting game. Another challenge of isolation is the temptation to take matters into our own hands. When we feel like nothing is happening, it can be hard to remain patient and trust in God's timing. Our natural instinct is to make things happen, to push for progress, even when it's not the right time. But rushing ahead without God's direction can lead to mistakes, detours, and unnecessary struggles. It's easy to get impatient, to try to fill the silence with our own efforts, but doing so can disrupt the very preparation that God is doing in us during this time. The greatest challenge of isolation, however, is the silence itself. We live in a world that is constantly noisy. Distractions are everywhere. We are used to having our attention pulled in 1,000 directions at once, whether through social media, work, or relationships. So when we find ourselves in a season of isolation, the silence can feel deafening. It can make us question everything, our decisions, our faith, and even God's love for us. The absence of external noise makes it harder to hear God's voice, and sometimes it can feel like He is silent too. However, it's important to remember that silence doesn't mean God is absent. In fact, silence often speaks louder than noise. It's in the quiet that God does His deepest work in us. He's teaching us to listen, to trust, and to rely on Him fully. The challenge lies in resisting the urge to fill that silence with our own worries, fears, or distractions. We have to learn to sit in that uncomfortable silence, trusting that God is preparing us for something bigger, even when we can't see it yet. Isolation isn't easy, and it doesn't always feel like a blessing. The challenges it brings, loneliness, doubt, impatience, can be overwhelming. But these challenges are the very things that God uses to strengthen our faith and grow our character. The emotional and mental struggles that come with isolation are the tools that God uses to refine us, to purify our hearts, and to teach us that His timing, His way, is perfect. So, while isolation may feel difficult and uncomfortable, it is ultimately part of the divine process that leads us into the purpose and destiny that God has for us. We must trust that the challenges of isolation are shaping us into the people we need to be to fulfill His calling on our lives. Despite the struggles and emotional weight of isolation, it's important to understand that God doesn't isolate His chosen for no reason. Isolation is a purposeful, intentional act of preparation, and it's through this season that God is doing something far deeper than we might initially realize. It's not about separation, it's about refinement. Isolation is where God sharpens us for the destiny ahead, and without it, we would not be able to handle the greatness He plans to give us. God uses isolation to strengthen us in ways that we might not experience in the busyness of life. It's easy to rely on our own strength when we have people around us, resources at our fingertips, and the noise of the world filling the space. But in isolation, all of that is stripped away. God places His chosen in a space where they can no longer rely on themselves or anyone else. It's just them and God, and it is in this space that they learn to trust God more deeply. Without isolation, we would never fully experience the depths of God's faithfulness, provision, and love. It's in the silence, in the alone time, that we see just how much God is with us, even when it feels like we're walking through life alone. One of the most powerful aspects of isolation is the opportunity it provides for deep intimacy with God. In the solitude, God's chosen are given the time and space to develop a closer relationship with Him. Without the distractions of daily life, God's chosen are free to seek Him in a way that isn't hurried or fragmented. The intimacy that comes from spending time alone with God is transformative. It's in those quiet moments of prayer, worship, and reflection that God's voice becomes clearer, His will more defined. During this time, God's chosen are being prepared to hear from Him in deeper ways, gaining clarity and direction for their future. Isolation is also a season for spiritual growth and maturity. When we are alone with God, we are confronted with our own weaknesses, our doubts, and the areas where we still need growth. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. This is when God prunes us, shaping us into the people He created us to be. He removes distractions, clears out the clutter in our hearts, and refines our character. While this process is not easy, it is essential for the calling that God has on our lives. Without it, we may not be ready for the challenges and responsibilities that will come when we step into our destiny. Another important aspect of isolation is the development of patience. In a world that thrives on instant gratification, waiting can feel like a punishment. But in God's economy, waiting is an essential part of the preparation process. God uses the waiting period to build patience, endurance, and trust. It's through waiting that we learn to align our hearts with His timing, rather than rushing ahead and forcing things to happen in our own way. During isolation, God teaches us that His plans are always worth the wait, and His timing is always perfect. Ultimately, isolation is not a dead end, but a stepping stone toward the fulfillment of God's promises. It's a place where we learn to depend fully on God, to listen for His voice, and to grow in the strength, patience, and faith needed to walk into the destiny He has for us. Without this time of preparation, we wouldn't be able to bear the weight of the calling ahead. While it may be difficult, isolation is where God prepares us for the greater things to come. And it is in this season that we are equipped to handle the blessings and responsibilities of the future. When we find ourselves in a season of isolation, it can feel like we're walking through a spiritual wilderness. It's easy to believe that God has forgotten us, that our prayers are going unanswered, and that the isolation is just a period of abandonment. But what if isolation is actually one of the most powerful things that God is using to shape and mold us for what lies ahead? The key lies in understanding that isolation is not a time of neglect. It's a time of active preparation. In fact, isolation is the crucible in which God refines His chosen for the work that He has planned for them. One of the most profound aspects of isolation is the way it forces us to confront our inner selves. When we're busy, distracted, and surrounded by the noise of the world, it's easy to ignore or suppress the things that need healing and attention. But in the quiet, God brings those things to the surface. It's in isolation that we are confronted with our fears, our insecurities, our doubts, and our weaknesses. These are not comfortable moments. In fact, they're often painful. But God doesn't do this to hurt us. He does it because He loves us and wants to heal us. He's preparing us for a greater future by purging us of anything that would hinder us from walking fully in His calling. Isolation is a time to be real with God and to be real with ourselves. It's in those moments of solitude that we come face to face with the areas of our lives where we need growth. It's not just a time to reflect on our weaknesses, but also on our strengths, gifts, and the potential that God has placed inside us. God is teaching us to see ourselves as He sees us. Isolation allows us to confront the lies we've believed about ourselves, to tear down the walls of fear and self-doubt, and to replace them with the truth of who God says we are. Without this time of self-reflection, we could easily miss the work that God wants to do in us. Another powerful aspect of isolation is the way it teaches us to rely on God alone. In a world that values independence and self-sufficiency, being forced into a season of solitude can be humbling, but it is in this humility that we truly learn to depend on God. In the wilderness, there are no distractions, no alternative resources to rely on. It's just you and God, and it's here that we begin to understand that He is enough. Our reliance on God is refined, and we begin to see that He is our true source of strength, provision, and guidance. This deeper dependence on Him will be critical when we step into the destiny He has for us, because we can't walk out the calling on our lives without being completely dependent on God's strength and direction. In isolation, God also teaches us patience. Our world has become accustomed to instant gratification. Answers, solutions, rewards, all seem to come quickly and easily. But God's timing is often very different. When we are isolated, we learn to wait on God's timing rather than rushing ahead in our own strength. Waiting can be uncomfortable, but it's in the waiting that we learn to trust God. His timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own plans. In isolation, we learn to trust that He is doing something in us, even when we don't see immediate results. The waiting season is one of the most important seasons in our lives, and it's in this time that God is shaping our hearts, teaching us that the process is just as important as the destination. God's chosen are often called into isolation because it is in these seasons that they are refined, strengthened, and prepared for their destiny. The emotional challenges, the discomfort, and the waiting aren't signs that we're on the wrong path. They are signs that God is doing something deep within us. Through isolation, God reveals our weaknesses and strengths, humbles our hearts, and deepens our reliance on Him. It's a season of spiritual growth and personal transformation, where we are shaped into the people God has called us to be. Without this time of preparation, we would not be ready to walk into the fullness of the destiny He has for us. So, rather than viewing isolation as a curse or a punishment, we can begin to see it as a necessary part of God's plan to prepare us for the greatness ahead. Isolation often brings with it a sense of silence. But it's within this silence that God does some of His most powerful work. In a world filled with noise, constant messages, opinions, distractions, and pressures, it's easy to get lost in the chaos and lose sight of God's voice. But when we are in a season of isolation, we are invited into a quieter space where God can speak to us without the interference of outside influences. This silence isn't empty. It's filled with God's presence. It's a time when we can hear His voice more clearly and discern His will for our lives. In isolation, God teaches us the value of listening. We may feel like we're not doing anything or that nothing is happening in this season, but in reality, God is doing the most profound work in our hearts. Just like the prophets of old who spent time alone with God, in solitude, we are learning to tune our hearts to His frequency. This time of stillness forces us to quiet the noise within us, the thoughts of doubt, fear, and worry, and listen intently for His direction. Often, we think we need to fill the silence with our own words, our own plans. But it's in the stillness that God's voice can be heard loud and clear. Jesus, too, embraced this silence. Before starting His public ministry, He spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and praying. During this time, He wasn't just preparing for the mission ahead. He was learning to listen and hear from God in the silence. In Matthew 4, we see that after Jesus' time in the wilderness, He was filled with the Spirit, ready to begin His ministry. It wasn't just physical preparation that He needed, it was spiritual alignment. The time in isolation was necessary for Jesus to hear from His Father and strengthen His resolve for the challenges that lay ahead. This theme of silence is echoed throughout Scripture, with God often using quiet moments to speak to His people. Think about Elijah, who encountered God not in the powerful wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. Elijah, like so many before and after him, needed to learn that God often speaks in the quiet, not in the loud and chaotic. It's in those times of solitude that God reveals Himself, not in rushing moments, but in stillness and patience. The silence that comes with isolation isn't something to fear. It's an invitation to hear from God in ways we may have never experienced before. In the quiet, God speaks truth into our lives, helps us discern the next steps in our journey, and reassures us of His presence. This isn't a time of punishment or absence. This is where God is doing His deepest work, preparing us spiritually for the greater things ahead. As we embrace this silence, we begin to recognize God's voice more clearly, and we learn to trust Him in ways that we couldn't in the busyness of life. This season of quiet is also a time for deep healing. It's in the silence that we are able to hear the pain, the wounds, and the fears that we've been too busy to address. When everything is stripped away, God gently reveals the areas of our hearts that need His touch. In isolation, He does not just prepare us for the calling. He heals us, refines us, and restores us, so that we can step into the fullness of His purpose for us, unburdened by past hurts or emotional baggage. As uncomfortable as isolation may be, it's in the silence and stillness that we are prepared to hear God's voice clearly, discern His will for our lives, and receive His healing touch. It's in this quiet time that God shapes and molds us, making us ready to walk boldly into the destiny He has designed for us. Silence isn't the absence of God. It's the space where we can truly encounter Him in the most intimate, transformative way. One of the most powerful aspects of isolation is that it often serves as the final stage of preparation before stepping into the destiny God has planned. While it may feel like a detour, isolation is not the end of the journey. It is the necessary process that precedes a breakthrough. It is in this season of solitude that God does His final refinements, preparing us to carry out the work He has called us to. We might look around at others who seem to be achieving their dreams, moving forward in their careers, or stepping into the lives they desire, while we remain in a place of waiting, uncertainty, and isolation. But this season is actually the most critical part of the process. God's chosen are often called into isolation because He is preparing them to handle the weight of the destiny that lies ahead. The greatness of the calling often requires a level of character and spiritual maturity that can only be developed in solitude. During this time, God works in the hearts of His people, removing impurities, strengthening their faith, and teaching them how to depend fully on Him. Without this preparation, they wouldn't be able to sustain the responsibility of the position or calling God is preparing them for. The isolation, though difficult and often painful, is what makes them ready to carry out the vision He has placed in their hearts. The process of isolation is also one of clarity. In the stillness, distractions are removed, and we are able to hear from God with greater precision. When there are no external voices, opinions, or pressures, God's voice becomes much clearer. In this space, we are able to better understand our purpose, the mission we are called to, and the direction we are supposed to take. It's like the fog clears, and we can see exactly where we're meant to go. Isolation allows God to refine our vision and gives us a fresh perspective on what truly matters. Many people are tempted to give up during this time, doubting whether their purpose will ever come to fruition. It's easy to feel forgotten when you're in a season of isolation, especially when you see others around you moving forward in their lives. But isolation is not a sign that God has forgotten you. It is actually a mark of His trust. He trusts you enough to set you apart and prepare you thoroughly for what's ahead. He knows that you need this time to build the necessary foundation for your destiny. Without it, we may find ourselves unprepared when the breakthrough finally comes. Think about the story of Joseph. Joseph's journey was filled with betrayal, isolation, and waiting. His brothers sold him into slavery, and he spent years in prison, seemingly forgotten and abandoned. Yet, during this time of isolation, Joseph was not just passively waiting for things to get better. He was actively being shaped for the position he would one day hold, second in command over all of Egypt. Through his time in isolation, Joseph learned humility, patience, and dependence on God. When he finally stepped into his role of authority, he was not only prepared to lead, but also to forgive his brothers and serve God's greater purpose for his life and his family. Similarly, in your own journey, isolation is the final stage of your preparation. It is the place where God works out the last pieces of the puzzle, where your character is refined, your faith is deepened, and your purpose is clarified. It's in isolation that you become the person capable of handling the calling ahead. The isolation may feel long, and it may feel lonely, but trust that it is a necessary part of God's perfect plan. The breakthrough is coming, and the time you've spent in solitude will equip you to walk into your destiny with strength, wisdom, and a heart fully aligned with God's will. As much as we might want to skip the difficult season of isolation, there's a temptation to rush through it. The longer we are in this place of solitude, the more impatient we become. It's natural to want to move on from the discomfort and see the results of all the waiting and growing we've been doing. But rushing through this season can have detrimental effects, both spiritually and emotionally. Isolation is not something to escape from. It's something to embrace, even in its difficulty. God has a purpose for this season, and we need to trust that His timing is perfect, even when it feels like we've been waiting forever. The temptation to rush through isolation often stems from a misunderstanding of its purpose. We may think that if we just push forward or try to force things to happen, we will accelerate our progress and get to the end of the journey more quickly. But in reality, rushing through the process only leads to frustration and setbacks. God's timing is not our own, and His ways are higher than our ways. He knows exactly when we will be ready to step into the next season of our lives, and it's in His perfect timing that our breakthrough will come. Consider the story of Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations. But for years, Abraham and his wife Sarah were unable to have children. In their impatience, they tried to force the promise to happen, and this led to the birth of Ishmael. While God still honored his promise, this act of rushing ahead caused unnecessary conflict and delay. God's plan for Abraham required patience, trust, and faith that God would fulfill his promise in his own time. If Abraham had waited, trusting in God's timing instead of trying to make things happen on his own, he would have avoided the pain and struggle that came from rushing ahead. Similarly, when we try to rush through our own season of isolation, we risk missing the lessons that God is trying to teach us. The season of solitude is where God works on our character, strengthens our faith, and prepares us for what's to come. If we don't allow God to do his work in us during this time, we may not be fully equipped for the challenges and opportunities that will arise when the isolation ends. We must learn to trust that God is doing something deep in us, even if we can't see the results immediately. Rushing the process also prevents us from fully embracing the healing and transformation that comes with isolation. This time is not just about preparing for the future. It's about allowing God to heal past wounds, remove distractions, and cleanse our hearts. If we rush through this time, we might miss the opportunity to experience the fullness of God's healing and refining. Healing takes time, and we must allow God the space to work in us without trying to speed things up. Another important reason not to rush through isolation is that God uses this time to develop qualities in us that will serve us well in the future. Patience, perseverance, humility, and trust are all cultivated in the waiting. These qualities are vital for stepping into the destiny God has for us. Without them, we might find ourselves overwhelmed by the responsibilities and challenges that come with success. Isolation is not a waste of time. It's the training ground where we are prepared to handle what lies ahead. The key to embracing isolation without rushing is surrender. It's about surrendering our own timeline and trusting in God's perfect timing. It's about learning to be content where we are, knowing that God is at work, even when we can't see the results right away. If we trust that He is faithful and that His timing is perfect, we can rest in the peace that comes from knowing He is preparing us for something greater. The breakthrough will come when we are ready. And in the meantime, we can trust that the season of isolation is not a delay, but a necessary part of God's plan to shape us into the people He's calling us to be. One of the most difficult aspects of isolation is the emotional battle that it often brings. During this season, it's easy to feel disconnected, overlooked, or as if our lives are on hold. The silence and solitude can trigger feelings of loneliness, doubt, and even despair. It's natural to wonder why we're being kept in such a place of stillness when we know we have a purpose, and it can be hard to reconcile the promise of a bright future with the reality of our current situation. But the emotional challenges of isolation are not signs that we are being abandoned by God. On the contrary, they are opportunities for deeper spiritual growth. The loneliness we feel can drive us closer to God, teaching us to depend on Him and not on human companionship for our sense of worth and identity. In isolation, God often removes the distractions of the world, including the relationships and comforts that we have relied on, in order to help us find our complete identity and fulfillment in Him alone. This process is not easy, but it's necessary for spiritual maturity. When we are isolated, we are forced to confront our fears and insecurities head-on. The absence of outside distractions brings these internal struggles to the surface. In a busy life, We can often mask or avoid the deeper issues within us. But in solitude, there is nowhere to hide. These emotional battles, whether it's fear of failure, fear of being alone, or insecurity about our worth, become the areas where God works the most. These are the places where He wants to heal, refine, and strengthen us. It's often through this wrestling that our faith is refined and our trust in God is deepened. At times, isolation can feel like a season of waiting without end, and it's easy to question if it will ever lead to anything. It's in these moments that we must hold on to the truth that God is not wasting our time. He is working in ways we may not fully understand. The emotional battles, the struggles with loneliness, and the feelings of uncertainty are all part of the process. God is strengthening us for the purpose He has in store, and the emotional challenges we face now are preparing us for a future that requires resilience, trust, and a deeper reliance on Him. Through the emotional struggles of isolation, God is also teaching us to surrender our need for control. It's easy to think we can orchestrate our own future, to force things to happen according to our timeline. But isolation teaches us that God's plan is always better than our own. We may not understand the purpose of the isolation while we're in it, but as we look back, we often see how it has shaped us for what's ahead. The emotional pain we experience during isolation can be one of the most significant catalysts for spiritual growth, as it strips us of self-reliance and forces us to rely completely on God's timing and provision. At the heart of these emotional struggles is the invitation to draw closer to God. In the isolation, there are no distractions, just us and Him. This is where we can find comfort in His presence, peace in His promises, and strength in His word. The loneliness we feel isn't a sign of abandonment, but a chance to experience God in a new way. He is with us in the silence, and He will carry us through the emotional battles, shaping us into the people He needs us to be. The emotional trials of isolation can feel overwhelming, but they are a part of the journey that leads to spiritual maturity. They challenge us to face our deepest fears, to grow in patience, and to trust God even when we can't see the end result. These challenges shape us into the individuals who will be ready to step into the destiny God has for us. By embracing the emotional struggles of isolation, we become more equipped to handle the future that God is preparing us for. As challenging as isolation can be, it ultimately leads to one of the most valuable outcomes: the development of a deep and unwavering trust in God. In the absence of external support, distractions, and even answers to our prayers, we are left with no choice but to rely fully on God. This season is not about relying on our own strength or ability to control situations. It's about learning to depend on God in ways we never have before. It's in this deep dependence that our faith is strengthened and refined. Trusting God in isolation is difficult because it requires us to let go of our own expectations and timelines. We want things to move faster. We want answers now. But God doesn't work on our schedule. His ways are higher, His thoughts are deeper, and His timing is always perfect. Isolation forces us to acknowledge that we are not in control. The sooner we accept this, the sooner we can enter into a deeper place of trust. It's here, in the quiet and the waiting, that we learn to trust God with our lives, with our future, and with every aspect of our journey. Trusting God in isolation is also about learning to hear His voice more clearly. When we're constantly surrounded by noise, whether it's the demands of work, family, or the world around us, it's easy to drown out the still, small voice of God. But in isolation, when everything else is quiet, we can finally hear Him speak. This is the time when God speaks to us with clarity, direction, and sometimes even correction. We learn to hear His guidance more clearly because we are no longer distracted by the noise of our everyday lives. This season is also about trusting God with our pain. In isolation, We often face emotional and spiritual challenges that force us to confront things we've been avoiding. It's not easy. We may feel lost, discouraged, or even like we've been forgotten. But it's in this place that God is doing some of His deepest healing work. He is teaching us that we can trust Him with our wounds, our fears, and our deepest hurts. Trusting God in isolation means trusting Him to heal us when we're broken and to lift us up when we feel like we can't go on. When we trust God in isolation, we also learn to trust Him with our dreams and desires. During this season, many of us may feel like we're not making any progress, like we're just stuck in a holding pattern. But this is when God is quietly working in the background, aligning things in His perfect timing. Trusting God means surrendering our dreams and desires to Him, knowing that He knows exactly what we need and when we need it. He is not only preparing us, but preparing the way for us. His timing is flawless, and He will open the doors we need when the time is right. The deeper our trust in God grows during isolation, the more confident we become in His ability to lead us into the future He has planned for us. Trust isn't something that can be rushed or forced. It's built over time. It's built through experiences, through moments of uncertainty, through prayers that go unanswered, and dreams that seem far off. But each step of the way, God is teaching us to trust in His character, His goodness, and His ability to bring about the plans He has for us. When we emerge from this season of isolation, we will not only be ready to step into our destiny, but we will be ready to walk confidently, knowing that God is always with us and will never let us go. As we emerge from the season of isolation, the transformation that takes place within us becomes evident. We are no longer the same people who entered that quiet, sometimes painful time of waiting. We are stronger, more resilient, and more attuned to God's voice. The wilderness, though challenging, has done its work, refining us, shaping us, and preparing us for the destiny that God has been quietly leading us toward. The waiting, the silence, and the solitude were not the end, but the beginning of something even greater. The first step out of isolation is often the most difficult. It's easy to feel uncertain about what's next, especially after spending so much time in solitude. But this is the moment when we are called to step into what God has been preparing us for. The promises He made to us during our isolation are now coming to fruition, and we must have the courage to walk into the next phase of His plan for us. It's a step of faith, a step into the unknown, trusting that God's plan is greater than anything we could have imagined. As we step into this new season, we are filled with a deeper sense of purpose. The lessons we learned in isolation have now equipped us to face the challenges ahead with a renewed strength and perspective. We no longer view obstacles as roadblocks, but as opportunities for growth and trust. The struggles we faced in isolation were not in vain. They have molded us into the people who can now handle the blessings and responsibilities that come with the next phase of our journey. We are ready to take on what God has for us, because we've been prepared in ways we didn't even realize while we were in the midst of it. God's chosen ones, after a season of isolation, are often more equipped to lead, to serve, and to carry out His work. It's not just about stepping into a position or receiving material blessings. It's about stepping into the fullness of who God has created us to be. Isolation has taught us humility, patience, trust, and dependence on God. It has stripped away our self-sufficiency and replaced it with a deep reliance on His power, wisdom, and timing. Now, we are ready to step into the calling He has placed on our lives with a heart that is fully aligned with His will. The beauty of emerging from isolation is that we carry with us a renewed sense of peace. We understand that God's timing is perfect, and that His plan is always better than our own. We've learned to embrace the journey, knowing that each step, even the difficult ones, has been part of a divine process that has been preparing us for something far greater. The purpose of isolation is not just to separate us from the world, but to bring us closer to God, to refine our character, and to make us ready for the destiny that lies ahead. As we step forward, we can do so with confidence, knowing that the isolation wasn't a detour or a mistake. It was God's intentional plan to shape us for His glory. The challenges of isolation have deepened our relationship with God, clarified our purpose, and strengthened our faith. Now, as we walk into the future, we do so with the knowledge that God is with us, guiding us, and empowering us to fulfill the calling He has placed on our lives. The waiting is over. The season of preparation has come to an end. It's time to step into the destiny that God has been preparing us for all along. If this video resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own season of isolation. Trust that God is using this time to prepare you for something greater. Keep moving forward, knowing that your breakthrough is coming. Don't forget to subscribe and check out our next video to dive even deeper into God's plan for your life.